The blood-red sunset painted the Wyoming sky as Margaret Allen stepped off the eastbound train into Beaver's dusty Main Street. Her hands trembled as she clutched her worn leather satchel, the letter that had brought her here tucked safely inside. The journey had taken everything she had: her savings, her courage, and what little remained of her trust in humanity. But the promise of a fresh start in this remote frontier town outweighed the fear gnawing at her insides. Margaret adjusted her simple blue dress, smoothing wrinkles that had settled during the long journey. At 24, her face already carried the subtle lines of someone who had weathered more storms than years would suggest. Her chestnut hair was neatly pinned beneath a modest hat, and her eyes, once described by a former suitor as windows to a gentle soul, now carried a wariness that hadn't been there 6 months ago. "Miss Allen." A deep voice startled her from her thoughts. She turned to face a tall man with broad shoulders and a weathered face beneath his wide-brimmed hat. His eyes were kind but cautious, set in a face marked by sun and wind. A small badge glinted on his vest. "Sheriff Thompson," she acknowledged, recognizing him from the description in the correspondence. "Thank you for meeting me." "Call me William," he said, taking her satchel. "Hope your journey wasn't too trying." "It was." "Educational," she replied carefully, following him toward a waiting wagon. "Mr. Jackson is expecting you at his ranch tomorrow. I offered to put you up at my sister's boarding house for the night, give you a chance to rest before meeting him and little Sarah." Margaret nodded gratefully, her throat tightening at the mention of the child. She'd come to Beaver to be a governess to a motherless 8-year-old girl, but the weight of what that truly meant hadn't fully settled until this moment. "How is she?" Margaret asked softly. "The girl," Sheriff Thompson's expression softened. "Sarah's a good kid, smart as a whip. Been through a lot, losing her mama 2 years ago, and now with what happened with the last governess." Margaret's steps faltered. "What happened with the last governess?" The sheriff helped her into the wagon before climbing up beside her. "That's Mr. Jackson's story to tell, I reckon. Not mine." As they rolled through the dusty street, Margaret observed the small Wyoming town. Beaver wasn't much a general store, saloon, church, and scattered buildings that served as homes and businesses for the town's modest population. Founded near the trading routes in 1868, it had grown slowly but steadily over its 8 years of existence, now serving as a hub for the surrounding ranches. "Not what you're used to in Boston, I imagine," the sheriff commented. Margaret's lips curved slightly. "I'm not running toward luxury, Sheriff Thompson. I'm running toward something else entirely." "And what might that be?" She turned to face him, the setting sun catching in her eyes. "Peace, purpose, perhaps a place where the past can't find me." William Thompson nodded slowly, seeming to understand more than she'd said aloud. "Well, Beaver's got its share of folks looking for fresh starts. Some find it, some don't." "And the Jacksons?" she asked. "What's their story?" "Jacob's a good man, works harder than most. Came here from Texas about 10 years ago with his wife Rebecca. Built that ranch from nothing." His expression darkened slightly. "When Rebecca died during that fever outbreak, well, something in him changed. He's still good to the core, but there's a guardedness now. The kind that comes from having your heart torn out." They arrived at a neat 2-story house with a sign reading Thompson Boarding House. A plump woman with the sheriff's same kind eyes greeted them from the porch. "This is my sister, Clara." The sheriff introduced them. "Clara, this is Miss Margaret Allen, the new governess for the Jackson Ranch." Clara's smile was warm as she ushered Margaret inside. "Come in, dear. You must be exhausted. I've got supper waiting and a hot bath can be arranged." For the first time in months, Margaret felt her shoulders relax slightly. The simple kindness was almost overwhelming after so long spent looking over her shoulder, expecting the worst from everyone she encountered. "Thank you," she managed, following Clara into the tidy house. Later that evening, freshly bathed and fed, Margaret sat on the edge of her bed and finally opened her satchel. She removed a small, framed photograph of her parents, both gone now, and a sealed envelope she hadn't been able to bring herself to destroy. The letter inside bore the handwriting of Richard Blackstone, the man whose betrayal had sent her fleeing across the country. Her fingers traced the edge of the envelope before she resolutely tucked it away again. The past was the past. Tomorrow would bring Jacob Jackson and his daughter Sarah her new beginning. The morning dawned clear and bright. Margaret dressed in her most practical outfit, a simple brown skirt and white blouse with a serviceable jacket. Her hair was neatly pinned back, and she wore her mother's small gold locket. First impressions mattered, especially when entering a household as its new authority on a child's education and care. After a hearty breakfast provided by Clara, she found herself once again in a wagon, this time driven by Sheriff Thompson's deputy, a young man named Timothy, who filled the journey with nervous chatter about the town's history and the surrounding landscape. "That's Jackson land starting at that fence line," Timothy pointed as they crested a hill. "One of the more successful operations in the county. Mr. Jackson runs about 200 head of cattle and has some fine horses too." Margaret absorbed the vista before her rolling hills dotted with cattle, stretches of grassland interrupted by clusters of trees, and in the distance, a substantial ranch house with several outbuildings. It was beautiful in its rugged simplicity, so different from Boston's crowded streets and oppressive social hierarchies. As they approached the main house, Margaret spotted a man standing on the porch, watching their arrival. Even from a distance, Jacob Jackson cut an imposing figure, tall and broad-shouldered, with the stance of someone accustomed to commanding respect. Beside him, partially hidden behind his leg, was a small figure that Margaret presumed was Sarah. The wagon rolled to a stop, and Timothy helped Margaret down. Up close, Jacob Jackson was even more imposing. He wore the practical clothes of a working rancher, denim trousers, a faded blue shirt with the sleeves rolled up revealing tanned, muscular forearms, and a weathered hat that he now removed, revealing dark hair streaked with premature silver at the temples. His face was handsome in a rugged way, with a strong jaw shadowed with stubble and eyes the color of a storm-darkened sky. "Mr. Jackson," Margaret greeted him, extending her hand. "I'm Margaret Allen." He took her hand briefly, his calloused palm rough against hers. "Miss Allen, welcome to Rocking J Ranch." His voice was deep and held a slight Texas drawl that his decade in Wyoming hadn't completely erased. He turned slightly, placing a gentle hand on his daughter's shoulder. "This is Sarah." The girl who stepped forward was small for 8, with dark braids and her father's storm-gray eyes. She wore a simple dress that had seen better days, and her expression was one of wary assessment. "Hello, Sarah," Margaret said softly, crouching down to the child's level. "I'm very pleased to meet you." Sarah didn't respond immediately, just studied Margaret with an intensity that was disconcerting in one so young. Finally, she spoke. "Are you going to leave too?" Margaret felt the weight of that question, understanding immediately that there was much more history here than the sheriff had revealed. She held the child's gaze steadily. "I made a promise to come here and teach you, Sarah. I intend to keep that promise." Something shifted in Sarah's expression, not quite trust, but perhaps a willingness to wait and see. Jacob cleared his throat. "Sarah, show Miss Allen to her room while I speak with Deputy Timothy." Sarah nodded and turned without a word, clearly expecting Margaret to follow. The girl led her through the front door into a surprisingly comfortable home. While not luxurious, The Jackson ranch house was well built and thoughtfully furnished. Polished wooden floors were partially covered with woven rugs. A large stone fireplace dominated the main living area, flanked by bookshelves filled with volumes that Margaret noted with approval. The furniture was sturdy and practical rather than fashionable, but everything was clean and well maintained. "This way," Sarah said, leading Margaret up a staircase to the second floor. The girl pushed open a door revealing a modest but pleasant bedroom. "This is where you'll sleep. The washroom is down the hall. My room is there," she pointed to a door across the hallway, "and Papa's room is at the end." Margaret set her satchel on the bed and took in her new surroundings. The room held a single bed with a quilt that had clearly been made with care, a small dresser, a washstand, and a desk positioned beneath a window that overlooked the ranch yard. It was simple but far more comfortable than she had expected. "It's lovely," Margaret said sincerely. "Thank you for showing me." Sarah hovered in the doorway, her small fingers fidgeting with the end of one braid. "The last lady said that too, but she still left." Margaret sat on the edge of the bed, patting the space beside her in invitation. After a moment's hesitation, Sarah joined her, though she maintained a careful distance. "Would you like to tell me about the last lady?" Margaret asked gently. Sarah's shoulders tensed. "Miss Caroline. She was nice at first. She taught me reading and numbers. But then she got mad at Papa all the time. They would argue when they thought I couldn't hear. And then one day she was just gone." Margaret absorbed this information carefully. "That must have been very confusing for you." Sarah nodded, her eyes downcast. "Papa said she wasn't the right person to be here. That's what he always says when people leave." "Have there been many people who have left?" "3 governesses since Mama died, and Mrs. Winters who used to cook for us. They all leave eventually." The resignation in the child's voice broke Margaret's heart. Before she could respond, heavy footsteps announced Jacob's approach. "Sarah, go help Mrs. Peterson with dinner preparations," he said from the doorway. Sarah slipped off the bed without argument and disappeared down the hallway. Jacob remained, filling the doorframe with his presence, his expression unreadable as he studied Margaret. "I trust the room is satisfactory?" he asked formally. "Very much so, thank you," Margaret replied, standing to face him properly. "Your home is lovely." Something flickered across his face pain, perhaps before his features settled back into their neutral mask. "My late wife made it so. I've tried to maintain it as best I can. I'm very sorry for your loss, Mr. Jackson." He acknowledged her sympathy with a short nod. "Sheriff Thompson likely told you Rebecca died 2 years ago. Fever took her and nearly took Sarah too." His jaw tightened at the memory. "Since then, we've struggled to find suitable help. I hope you'll prove more permanent than your predecessors." There was a challenge in his words that Margaret couldn't miss. "May I ask what happened with the previous governess?" Jacob's expression hardened. Miss Caroline Winters had aspirations beyond her station. "She came here under false pretenses, interested more in securing a husband than in caring for my daughter. When I made it clear that wasn't possible, she chose to leave rather abruptly." Margaret absorbed this, wondering what the truth might be beneath his clipped explanation. "I assure you, Mr. Jackson, I have no such aspirations. I'm here solely to educate and care for Sarah." "Good," he said firmly, "because I've no intention of remarrying. My daughter needs a teacher and a proper feminine influence, not a new mother. I've made that mistake before." Before Margaret could respond to this revelation, he continued in a more businesslike tone. "Your duties will include Sarah's education, reading, writing, arithmetic, history, and whatever other subjects you deem appropriate. You'll also oversee her general well-being, meals, appropriate dress, and such. Mrs. Peterson comes 3 times a week to clean and help with cooking, but you'll be responsible for Sarah the remainder of the time." "I understand," Margaret said, maintaining her composure despite his brusqueness. "Your Sundays are your own, should you wish to attend church in town. I can arrange transportation. You'll receive 1 day off each month to conduct personal business in Beaver. Your salary will be paid monthly, as we agreed in our correspondence." "That sounds fair." Jacob seemed to relax marginally, perhaps relieved she wasn't arguing. "Dinner is at 6. I'll leave you to settle in. The bureau has fresh linens, and there should be water in the pitcher for washing up." With that, he turned and left, his footsteps heavy on the wooden stairs. Margaret released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Jacob Jackson was not what she'd expected, more complex, more wounded than his letters had suggested. And Sarah, with her wary eyes and resignation to abandonment, presented a challenge Margaret hadn't fully anticipated. But then, she reminded herself, she hadn't come to Wyoming expecting ease. She'd come seeking safety and purpose, and if that purpose now included helping a wounded child learn to trust again, so be it. As for the child's equally wounded father, Margaret pushed that thought aside. Jacob Jackson had made it abundantly clear that he wanted nothing more from her than her services as a governess. And given her own recent history with men who presented one face while concealing another, that suited Margaret perfectly fine. The next few weeks established a rhythm to life at the Rocking J Ranch. Margaret rose early, often finding Jacob already gone to work with his men. Sarah proved to be bright and curious once her initial wariness began to thaw, and their lessons together were largely enjoyable. Margaret discovered that Sarah's education had been inconsistent at best, with gaps that needed addressing. The girl read well for her age but struggled with mathematics and had almost no knowledge of geography or science. Creating a structured curriculum became Margaret's first priority. "Why do I need to know where Philadelphia is?" Sarah asked one morning, frowning at the map Margaret had spread across the desk in the small room they'd converted into a schoolroom. "Because the world is much larger than Beaver, Wyoming," Margaret explained. "And knowledge of that world will give you choices when you're older." Sarah traced the outline of the Wyoming territory with her small finger. "I'm never leaving here. This is my home." The declaration, made with such certainty, gave Margaret pause. "It's good to love your home, Sarah. But it's also good to know what else exists beyond it." The girl looked up, her gray eyes serious. "Did you love your home in Boston?" Margaret considered the question carefully. "I loved parts of it, the libraries, the harbor, the changing of the seasons, but sometimes a place stops feeling like home and you need to find somewhere new." "Because bad things happen?" Sarah asked perceptively. "Sometimes," Margaret acknowledged. "Or sometimes because you change and you need to find a place that fits who you've become." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "Like how Papa changed after Mama died. He doesn't laugh anymore or tell stories like he used to." Margaret felt a pang at this insight into the man Jacob had once been. In their daily interactions, he remained unfailingly polite but distant. He would inquire about Sarah's progress, discuss household matters that required his attention, and occasionally join them for meals when ranch work permitted. But the wall he'd built around himself remained impenetrable. "Loss changes people," Margaret said gently. "But that doesn't mean the person they were is gone forever." Sarah didn't look convinced. "Miss Caroline said Papa needed a new wife to make him happy again. Is that true?" Margaret chose her next words carefully. "I think happiness comes from many sources, Sarah. Your father clearly loves you very much, and that brings him joy even if he doesn't always show it the way he once did." "But you're not going to be his new wife," Sarah pressed, watching Margaret's face closely. "No," Margaret said firmly. "I'm here to be your teacher and to help care for you." That's all. Something like relief crossed Sarah's face, which Margaret found curious. Before she could explore it further, the lesson was interrupted by Mrs. Peterson calling them for lunch. As the days passed, Margaret began to understand the complexity of the household she'd entered. Mrs. Peterson, a widow from town who came to clean and cook, proved to be a wealth of information. Some offered freely, some gleaned through careful observation. The boss was different before Mrs. Jackson passed, she told Margaret one afternoon as they worked together in the kitchen. Smiled more. Had the men and their families over for socials. The place had life to it. It seems peaceful now, Margaret observed, kneading dough for the evening's bread. Mrs. Peterson snorted softly. Peaceful ain't the same as living, Miss Allen. This house has been too quiet since Rebecca died. That child needs laughter, and Mr. Jackson. She shook her head. Man's been sleepwalking for 2 years. What about the other governesses? Margaret asked, trying to sound casual. Sarah mentioned there were 3 before me, Mrs. Peterson's hand stilled briefly over the vegetables she was chopping. First one was an older lady, strict as they come. Didn't last 3 months before deciding ranch life wasn't to her liking. Second was young, not much older than you. Pretty little thing. Seemed more interested in making eyes at the ranch hands than teaching Sarah. And Miss Caroline, Margaret prompted when the older woman paused. A complex expression crossed Mrs. Peterson's weathered face. Miss Caroline was ambitious. Saw a widower with a successful ranch and figured she'd make herself indispensable. Started trying to change things, rearranging furniture, suggesting Mr. Jackson needed to socialize more, host dinners for the important folks in the county. That doesn't seem unreasonable, Margaret ventured. Mrs. Peterson gave her a knowing look. Wasn't what she suggested so much as how she went about it, acting like she was already the mistress of this house when she'd barely arrived, and the way she treated Sarah. She shook her head. Like the child was an obstacle to be managed rather than the heart of this household. Margaret absorbed this information thoughtfully. So she left when Mr. Jackson rebuffed her advances. That's the short of it, Mrs. Peterson agreed, though there was more to the story, always is. She eyed Margaret speculatively. You're different than the others, got a steadiness to you, and you genuinely care for the child. I do, Margaret acknowledged. She's remarkable. Just be careful with your heart, Miss Allen. This house has seen enough pain. It was a cryptic warning that Margaret pondered that evening as she sat on the porch, enjoying the cool night air after Sarah had gone to bed. The vast Wyoming sky stretched endlessly above her, stars scattered like diamond dust across the darkness. In Boston, she had rarely seen the stars this clearly, the city's glow and tall buildings obscuring the heavens. The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted her reverie. Jacob emerged from the darkness, having completed his evening rounds of the property. He paused when he saw her, seemingly surprised to find her there. Miss Allen, he acknowledged with a nod. Enjoying the evening, it's beautiful here, she said honestly. So vast and open. Something in her tone must have revealed more than she intended, for he studied her face in the lantern light. Different from what you're accustomed to. In every way possible, she agreed. But that's not unwelcome. He hesitated, then surprised her by taking a seat in the chair beside hers. It was the first time he'd chosen to extend a conversation with her beyond what was strictly necessary. Sarah seems happier lately, he said after a moment, more like herself. She's a wonderful child, Mr. Jackson, intelligent and kind. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Like her mother. The smile faded quickly. Rebecca would be grateful to know Sarah has someone like you looking after her education. The mention of his late wife created an opening Margaret hadn't expected. Sarah speaks of her often. It's clear she remembers her mother with great love. Jacob's hands tightened on the arms of his chair. Rebecca was the heart of this place. When she died, I thought Sarah and I would follow her from grief alone. The raw honesty in his voice moved Margaret. But you didn't. You've created a stable home for your daughter. A poor substitute for what she lost, he said bitterly. Children are remarkably resilient, Mr. Jackson. Sarah doesn't need a perfect life, she needs to know she's loved and secure. You've given her that. He turned to look at her fully, his expression softening slightly. You've a way of seeing the good in things, Miss Allen. Not always, she admitted, thinking of the circumstances that had driven her from Boston. But I'm trying to relearn the habit. Something in her tone must have revealed more than she intended, for his gaze sharpened with curiosity. You left something behind in Boston. It wasn't quite a question, but Margaret felt compelled to answer anyway. Someone, not something. A man who wasn't what he appeared to be. Jacob nodded slowly, seeming to understand what she wasn't saying. Betrayal leaves deep marks. Yes, she agreed softly. Almost as deep as grief. They sat in companionable silence for several minutes, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Jacob stood. It's getting late, thank you, for what you're doing for Sarah. It's my pleasure, truly. He paused, seeming on the verge of saying something more, then simply nodded. Good night, Miss Allen. Good night, Mr. Jackson. As she watched him disappear into the house, Margaret felt something shift between them, not dramatically but perceptibly. For the first time, Jacob had spoken to her as a person, not merely as an employee. It was a small thing, but in the weeks she'd spent at Rocking J Ranch, she'd learned that with Jacob Jackson, small changes often signified deeper currents. The following Sunday, Margaret accompanied Sarah and Jacob to the small church in Beaver. It was her first return to town since her arrival at the ranch, and she found herself unexpectedly nervous as the wagon approached the settlement. Boston society had trained her to be hyper-aware of appearances and gossip. Even in this small frontier town, she felt the weight of eyes upon them as they arrived together, the widowed rancher, his daughter, and the new governess. The church service was simple but heartfelt, led by a young pastor whose enthusiasm compensated for his occasional theological stumbles. Margaret found herself enjoying the straightforward sermon and the warm fellowship of the congregation afterward. Several women introduced themselves, clearly curious about her but welcoming nonetheless. Miss Allen, isn't it? A handsome woman in her 30s approached with a genuine smile. I'm Eliza Barnes. My husband runs the general store. We're so pleased you've come to Beaver. Thank you, Margaret replied, warming to the woman's friendly manner. Everyone has been very welcoming. We've been praying for Jacob and Sarah, Eliza continued, lowering her voice slightly. Such a tragedy, losing Rebecca that way, and then the difficulties with finding suitable help. Her eyes darted briefly to where Jacob stood speaking with several men. How are you finding life at the ranch? Very agreeable, Margaret said diplomatically. Sarah is a delightful child and Mr. Jackson has been most accommodating. Eliza's expression revealed both approval and lingering curiosity. Jacob's a good man, one of the finest in the county. He's just been through so much. She squeezed Margaret's arm. You must join us for dinner sometime, I insist, perhaps next Sunday. Before Margaret could respond, Sarah appeared at her side, slipping a small hand into hers with a familiarity that surprised and touched her. Miss Margaret, Papa says we can visit the mercantile before heading home if you'd like. Eliza's eyebrows rose slightly at the child's obvious attachment, but her smile remained warm. I'll let you go, but remember my invitation. The Barnes household always has room for new friends. As they walked toward the general store, Sarah maintained her hold on Margaret's hand. It was the first such gesture the child had initiated, and Margaret felt its significance deeply. "Mrs. Barnes seems very nice," she commented. Sarah nodded. "She gives me peppermint sticks sometimes. She was Mama's friend." "It's good that your mother had such kind friends." Sarah looked up at her with those perceptive gray eyes. "Would you like to be my friend too, Miss Margaret, not just my teacher?" Margaret felt her heart swell. "I would like that very much, Sarah." The girl nodded solemnly, as if confirming a serious agreement. "Good. Because I like you better than the others. You don't make Papa angry or sad." Before Margaret could ask what she meant by this intriguing statement, they reached the mercantile where Jacob waited. His eyes dropped to their joined hands, and something complicated passed across his face: surprise, followed by what might have been gratitude. The general store was a treasure trove of necessities and small luxuries. While Jacob conducted business with Mr. Barnes, Margaret helped Sarah select a new hair ribbon and a small bag of hard candies as a special treat. As they browsed, Margaret became aware of whispered conversations and curious glances from other customers. "Don't mind the gossips, Mrs. Barnes said quietly, appearing at Margaret's elbow. "Small towns run on talk, and a pretty new face at the Jackson Ranch was bound to set tongues wagging." Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks. "There's nothing to gossip about. I'm simply Sarah's governess." Mrs. Barnes' eyes held a knowing gleam. "Of course. But you should know, there are many in town who would be pleased to see Jacob find happiness again. Rebecca would have wanted that." Before Margaret could formulate a response to this unsettling observation, Jacob approached, his business concluded. "We should head back. Looks like weather coming in from the west." The ride back to the ranch was quiet, with Sarah falling asleep against Margaret's side as the wagon rumbled along the rutted road. Dark clouds were indeed gathering on the horizon, promising an evening storm. "She's growing attached to you," Jacob observed, glancing at his sleeping daughter. "I'm growing attached to her as well," Margaret admitted. His hands tightened on the reins. "I should warn you that might not be wise." The statement stung more than Margaret expected. "Are you planning to dismiss me, Mr. Jackson?" "No," he said quickly. "Your work has been exemplary, but—" He hesitated. "Experience has taught me that arrangements such as ours can be temporary. People leave. Circumstances change." "I have no intention of leaving," Margaret said firmly. "Unless, of course, you find my services unsatisfactory." Jacob's profile was stark against the darkening sky. "It's not a question of satisfaction, Miss Allen. It's a question of complications." "What sort of complications?" He didn't answer immediately, seemingly struggling with how to express his thoughts. Finally, he said, "Sarah lost her mother. Then she lost 3 governesses in succession. Each departure reinforced her fear of abandonment. I won't have her heart broken again." Margaret understood then his concern wasn't professional but personal. "Mr. Jackson, I cannot promise that nothing will ever change. Life doesn't permit such certainties, but I can promise that I would never willingly hurt Sarah." "Intentions and outcomes don't always align," he said grimly. The wagon crested a hill, bringing the ranch into view below. The main house stood solid against the approaching storm, smoke curling from the chimney where Mrs. Peterson had likely stoked the fire before leaving for her own home in town. "What happened with Miss Caroline?" Margaret asked suddenly, seizing the moment of privacy while Sarah slept. "The real story." Jacob's jaw tightened. "She overstepped, made assumptions about her place in our household that were unwarranted." "She wanted to marry you," Margaret stated, not a question. "She wanted this ranch and the status that comes with it," he corrected harshly. "Marriage to me was merely the vehicle. When I made it clear that wasn't possible, she—" He paused. "She tried to use Sarah against me." suggested the child needed a mother so desperately that I was being selfish in denying her one. Margaret absorbed this, understanding better now the complexity of the situation she'd entered. And that's why you specified in your advertisement that you were seeking a governess, not a potential wife. Yes, his voice was clipped. I won't subject Sarah or myself to that kind of manipulation again. I appreciate your candor, Mr. Jackson. And I hope my actions have demonstrated that I harbor no such ambitions. My only goal is to provide Sarah with the education and care she deserves. Something in his expression eased slightly. They have, Miss Allen, more than you know. The first raindrops began to fall as they reached the ranch yard. Jacob quickly unhitched the horses while Margaret gently woke Sarah and ushered her inside. By the time they had settled in the warm house, the storm was lashing against the windows in earnest. That night, as thunder rolled across the Wyoming sky, Margaret sat at her bedroom window watching lightning illuminate the landscape in brilliant flashes. The conversation with Jacob had unsettled her more than she cared to admit. Not because of his suspicions, those were understandable given his experience, but because of her own reaction to them. The truth was, in the weeks she'd spent at Rocking J Ranch, something had shifted within her. The peace she'd sought in leaving Boston had indeed begun to take root, but alongside it grew something she hadn't anticipated: a genuine affection for Sarah, and a complicated interest in Jacob Jackson that extended beyond their professional relationship. It was foolish, she knew. Jacob had made his position abundantly clear, and after Richard's betrayal, Margaret had sworn to guard her heart more carefully. Yet here she was, contemplating possibilities that had no business entering her mind. Thunder crashed directly overhead, making the window panes rattle. A moment later, a timid knock sounded at her door. "Miss Margaret," Sarah's voice was small and frightened. "Are you awake?" Margaret quickly crossed the room and opened the door to find Sarah clutching a worn rag doll, her face pale in the lamplight. "The storm woke you." Sarah nodded, jumping slightly as another thunderclap shook the house. "Mama used to let me sleep with her when it stormed, but Papa—" She trailed off, looking embarrassed. "He says I'm too big for that now." Margaret's heart ached for the child. "I don't think anyone is ever too big to be frightened sometimes. Would you like to stay with me until the storm passes?" Relief flooded Sarah's face as she nodded eagerly. Margaret ushered her to the bed, tucking the quilt around them both as Sarah snuggled close. The child's trust was a precious gift, one Margaret didn't take lightly. "My mother used to tell me that thunder was just the angels rearranging furniture in heaven," Margaret said softly. Sarah giggled. "That's silly. Mrs. Peterson says it's the good Lord bowling." "That's another good explanation," Margaret agreed, smiling. "Either way, it's nothing to fear. Did you have storms like this in Boston?" "Sometimes, but they sounded different there. The buildings are closer together, so the thunder seems to bounce between them." Sarah considered this. "Do you miss it?" "Boston," Margaret thought carefully before answering. "I miss certain things, the libraries, the harbor, some of the people, but I'm happy here, Sarah. Even though it's so different, sometimes different is exactly what we need." Sarah's eyes were growing heavy as the storm began to move away, the thunder more distant now. "I'm glad you came here, Miss Margaret." "So am I," Margaret whispered, stroking the child's dark hair. Soon Sarah's breathing deepened into sleep. Her small body relaxed in complete trust against Margaret. The responsibility of that trust weighed heavily, not as a burden but as a precious gift. Whatever complications might lie ahead with Jacob, Margaret knew with absolute certainty that she would do everything in her power to protect this child's heart. The weeks turned into months, and summer gave way to autumn. The aspens that dotted the ranch's higher pastures turned golden, creating pockets of brilliant color against the evergreens. Ranch life shifted with the season's cattle were moved to lower pastures, buildings were prepared for the coming winter, and food stores were carefully managed. Margaret's role expanded gradually beyond Sarah's education. She began helping with household accounts, planning meals with Mrs. Peterson, and even assisting Jacob in corresponding with cattle buyers. Her previous experience working in her father's law office in Boston had equipped her with organizational skills that proved useful in managing the business aspects of ranch life. One crisp October afternoon, Margaret sat at the desk in the study, reviewing supply inventories, when Jacob entered. He had just returned from riding the boundaries with his foreman, and his face was wind-burned from the increasingly cold air. "Miss Allen," he greeted her, removing his hat. "Hard at work, I see." "Just finalizing the winter supply list," she explained. "I think we should increase the flour order by 20 pounds over last year's. Mrs. Peterson mentioned that Sarah's growing appetite will likely continue through the winter." Jacob's lips curved slightly. "You've become quite knowledgeable about running this ranch." "I hope that's a compliment," she replied, setting down her pencil. "It is." He moved closer, examining the neat columns of figures she'd written. "You have a head for numbers. My father insisted on it. He believed women should understand finances even if society didn't expect it of them." A progressive view, he was in many ways. Margaret smiled at the memory. He would have liked it here. He always claimed city life was too confined for his spirit. Jacob studied her face. "You rarely speak of your family." "There's little to tell. My parents both passed away within a year of each other when I was 20. I had no siblings. After their deaths, I lived with my mother's cousin until—" She paused. "Until circumstances brought me west." Jacob seemed to sense her reluctance to elaborate. "Well, their loss is our gain. Sarah's education has progressed remarkably under your guidance." The compliment warmed her. "She's a bright child, and a joy to teach." "Yes," he agreed, his expression softening the way it always did when discussing his daughter. "Rebecca would be pleased with how she's growing." It was the most frequent reference he made to his late wife what she would think of Sarah's development. Margaret had noticed that he rarely spoke of Rebecca directly, seeming to find it too painful still. "Mr. Jackson," she began hesitantly, "Thanksgiving will be upon us soon. I was wondering if you had traditions that Sarah and I should prepare for." A shadow crossed his face. "Rebecca used to make quite an occasion of it, invited the ranch hands and their families. There was music, dancing." He shook his head. "We haven't celebrated properly since she died." "Perhaps this year could be different," Margaret suggested carefully. "Not the same as before, but something new, for Sarah's sake." Jacob was quiet for a long moment. "You think that would be good for her?" "I think children need traditions and celebrations. They mark the passage of time and create memories that sustain them." She hesitated, then added softly, "And perhaps it would be good for you as well." Their eyes met, and Margaret saw something shift in his gaze, a recognition, perhaps, that she was speaking not as an employee but as someone who cared about his well-being. "What would you suggest?" he asked finally. Relief flooded through her. "Nothing elaborate. Dinner with some of the hands and their families, perhaps the sheriff and his sister, simple food, some music." She smiled. "Sarah mentioned that you play the fiddle." Surprise registered on his face. "I haven't touched it in years." "She remembers you playing. She told me it was her favorite sound in the world." Jacob looked away, clearly moved. After a moment he nodded. "All right. A small Thanksgiving gathering, but I make no promises about the fiddle." Margaret smiled. "Thank you." As he turned to leave, he paused at the door. "Miss Allen Margaret," he said, using her given name for the first time. "You've brought something back to this house that I thought was lost forever." Before she could respond, he was gone, leaving her with a fluttering sensation in her chest that she refused to acknowledge. The Thanksgiving preparations gave the ranch a renewed sense of purpose. Sarah threw herself into helping with decorations, insisting on making paper chains and corn husk dolls like her mother had taught her. Mrs. Peterson approached the menu planning with enthusiasm, grateful to have a proper occasion to showcase her cooking skills again. Word spread quickly among the ranch hands, and Margaret was touched by their genuine pleasure at the revival of what had apparently been a cherished tradition during Rebecca's lifetime. Several wives offered to contribute dishes, and one of the younger cowboys volunteered to play his harmonica for dancing. 2 days before Thanksgiving, Margaret was in the kitchen with Sarah, teaching her to make apple pies from Rebecca's old recipe, which Mrs. Peterson had preserved. Their hands were dusted with flour, and Sarah's face was alight with concentration as she carefully crimped the edge of her first pie. Mama would make little designs on the top, Sarah recalled, her expression softening with memory. Birds and leaves and such. Would you like to try that? Margaret asked, offering her a small knife for creating vents in the crust. Sarah nodded eagerly. With Margaret's guidance, she carved a simple pattern of leaves across the top of her pie. When she finished, she studied her work critically. It's not as pretty as Mama's, she decided. But it's your very own design, Margaret pointed out, and I think it's beautiful. Sarah beamed, flour dusting her cheek. Do you think Papa will like it? I'm certain he will. The sound of boots in the hallway announced Jacob's return from the barn. He appeared in the kitchen doorway, his eyes widening at the sight of the flour-covered pear. What's all this? He asked, taking in the row of pies cooling on the windowsill. Apple pies for Thanksgiving, Sarah announced proudly. I made this one all by myself. Well, Miss Margaret helped a little. Jacob approached, examining Sarah's creation with exaggerated seriousness. That's fine work, Sarah. Those leaves are especially well done. Sarah's face lit up at the praise. It's like Mama used to make, do you remember? Something flickered in Jacob's eyes, pain, but also something softer. I remember, he said quietly. She'd sing while she baked, old songs her mother taught her. I don't remember the songs, Sarah said, her face falling slightly. Jacob hesitated, then began to hum softly a gentle, rolling tune that Margaret didn't recognize. Sarah's eyes widened. That's it, she exclaimed. That's one of Mama's songs. Jacob nodded, his voice growing slightly stronger as he transitioned from humming to singing softly. Come all you fair and tender ladies. Be careful how you court young men. They're like a star on a summer's morning, first appear and then they're gone. His voice was surprisingly melodic, rich and warm in the kitchen's close quarters. Sarah closed her eyes, swaying slightly to the rhythm of the old ballad. When Jacob finished, there were tears on her cheeks, but she was smiling. I remember now, she whispered. Jacob knelt, drawing her into his arms, heedless of the flour that transferred to his shirt. Your Mama lives in those memories, Sarah, and in you. Margaret felt like an intruder on this intimate moment between father and daughter. She quietly began cleaning up the baking mess, giving them privacy. But as she turned away, Jacob caught her eye over Sarah's head. There was gratitude in his gaze and something more that made her heart beat faster. Miss Margaret helped me remember, Sarah was saying, pulling back from her father's embrace. She says it's good to talk about Mama, that it keeps her close. Jacob's gaze remained on Margaret. Miss Margaret is very wise. The simple statement carried a weight that Margaret felt in her core. For the first time, she allowed herself to acknowledge what she had been trying to deny for weeks, that her feelings for Jacob Jackson had grown far beyond what was appropriate for her position in his household. And worse, from the way he was looking at her now, She feared those feelings might not be entirely one-sided. Thanksgiving Day dawned clear and cold. The ranch house had been transformed with Sarah's decorations, paper chains draped from the ceiling beams, autumn leaves pressed between sheets of wax paper adorning the walls, and candles everywhere to create a warm, inviting glow. Margaret wore her best dress, a deep green wool with a modestly scooped neckline and covered buttons down the front. She had splurged on a bottle of rose water in the general store during her last trip to town, and she dabbed a little at her wrists and throat before pinning her hair into a more elaborate style than her usual practical arrangement. Sarah knocked on her door just as she was finishing. "Miss Margaret, you look beautiful," the child exclaimed. "Like a princess in my storybook." Margaret laughed, touched by the girl's enthusiasm. "Thank you, Sarah. You look very pretty yourself." Sarah twirled, showing off her blue dress with white lace collar. "Papa said Mama would be proud of how grown-up I look." "She certainly would," Margaret agreed, offering her hand. "Shall we go down? The guests will be arriving soon." The afternoon unfolded better than Margaret had dared hope. The ranch hands and their families arrived in wagons, bearing additional dishes and good cheer. Sheriff Thompson came with his sister Clara, who embraced Margaret warmly. Eliza Barnes and her husband brought their 3 children, who quickly engaged Sarah in games of tag around the barn until dinner was ready. The meal itself was a triumph: roast turkey with all the trimmings, vegetables from the ranch's root cellar, and the apple pies that had survived until dessert. The dining table had been extended with boards laid across sawhorses to accommodate everyone, and the conversation flowed as freely as the coffee and cider. Margaret found herself seated beside Jacob at the head of the table, a position that drew knowing glances from some of the older ranch wives. She tried to ignore the implications, focusing instead on ensuring everyone's cups remained filled and complimenting Mrs. Peterson on the excellent food. After dinner, the furniture in the main room was pushed back to create space for dancing. The young cowboy with the harmonica was joined by an older ranch hand with a banjo, and to everyone's delight, Jacob disappeared upstairs only to return with his fiddle case. "Haven't seen that in a coon's age," one of the older hands remarked with obvious pleasure. Jacob ran his fingers over the instrument, checking the tuning. "Might be a bit rusty," he warned, but when he drew the bow across the strings, the music that emerged was anything but rusty. The fiddle sang in his hands, a lively reel that soon had boots stomping and hands clapping. Couples formed, swinging each other through the steps of dances that had traveled west with them from distant homes. Margaret sat with Sarah, watching the festivities with a smile. The girl's eyes never left her father as he played, pride and joy illuminating her face. "He used to play every Saturday night," Sarah confided. "Mama would dance with everyone but saved the last dance for Papa." As if conjured by her words, the musicians transitioned to a slower tune. Jacob's eyes found Margaret across the room, and he inclined his head slightly in invitation. Heart hammering, she shook her head, but Sarah was already pushing her to her feet. "Go on," the child urged. "Papa wants to dance with you." Before Margaret could protest further, Sheriff Thompson appeared at her elbow. "May I have the honor, Miss Allen?" he asked with a friendly smile. Relieved and disappointed in equal measure, Margaret allowed him to lead her into the circle of dancers. William Thompson proved to be a capable if unexceptional dancer, guiding her through the simple steps with comfortable ease. "You've worked a minor miracle here," he commented as they turned. "Haven't seen this much life in this house since before Rebecca passed." "It was Mr. Jackson's decision," Margaret demurred. The sheriff's eyes twinkled knowingly. "At your suggestion, I'd wager." He guided her through a turn. The whole town's noticed the change in both Jacob and Sarah since you arrived. Margaret felt her cheeks warm. I'm simply doing my job, Sheriff. Are you now? He asked with gentle skepticism. Seems to me there's more than employment at stake here. Before she could formulate a response, the music ended. The sheriff bowed, and as he straightened, Jacob was suddenly there beside them. Mind if I cut in, William? He asked, his voice deceptively casual. The sheriff grinned, releasing Margaret's hand. She's all yours, Jacob. A new tune began slower, more intimate than the previous dances. Jacob's hand settled at Margaret's waist, the other clasping her fingers. Despite the propriety of the dance position, Margaret felt the touch like fire through her dress. You've created something remarkable today, Jacob said softly as they moved together. I'd almost forgotten what this house could feel like. Everyone was eager to revive the tradition, Margaret replied. They've missed this. Sarah has missed this. And what about you? He asked, his eyes intent on hers. What do you miss, Margaret? The question caught her off guard with its directness. I'm not sure what you mean. You left Boston suddenly. There must be things people you left behind. Margaret's step faltered slightly, but Jacob's hand steadied her. There's nothing in Boston that I miss enough to return for, she said finally. My life is here now. Something shifted in his expression, relief perhaps. With Sarah, he said, as if confirming a fact. Yes, she agreed. Then, gathering her courage, she added, and with you. The words hung between them, more revealing than she had intended. Jacob's hand tightened almost imperceptibly at her waist. Margaret, he began, his voice lower. There are things you should know, but whatever he intended to say was interrupted as the music ended and Sarah bounded up to them, her face flushed with excitement. Papa, Miss Margaret, did you see? I danced with Mr. Barnes and he said I'm a natural. The moment broken, Jacob released Margaret and turned his attention to his daughter. I saw, sweetheart. You were the belle of the ball. As the evening continued, Margaret found herself watching Jacob, the ease with which he now moved among his guests, the genuine smile that had returned to his face, the tenderness with which he interacted with Sarah. Whatever he had been about to say during their dance remained unspoken, but she caught him looking at her more than once with an expression that made her wonder. The last guests departed well after midnight, with promises to gather again at Christmas. Sarah had fallen asleep on the settee hours earlier, and Jacob carried her up to bed while Margaret and Mrs. Peterson began the cleanup. That went even better than the old days, Mrs. Peterson declared as she wrapped leftover food. You've got a gift, Miss Allen, for bringing people together. It was a team effort, Margaret insisted, though she was pleased by the compliment. Hum, the older woman hummed skeptically. Don't think I didn't notice the way Mr. Jackson looked at you during that dance. Margaret concentrated on washing a plate, hoping the heat in her cheeks wasn't visible. Mrs. Peterson, that's hardly, no need to get flustered, Mrs. Peterson interrupted with a knowing smile. It's been a long time coming, is all I'm saying. Man deserves some happiness, and so do you from what I can tell. Before Margaret could formulate a response to this startling assessment, Jacob returned to the kitchen. Sarah's sound asleep, he reported. Didn't even wake when I tucked her in. No surprise there, Mrs. Peterson said, wiping her hands on her apron. Child had more excitement today than in the past 2 years combined. She gathered her shawl from a hook by the door. I'll be heading home now. My Thomas should be along with the wagon any minute. You're not staying to finish? Jacob asked, gesturing to the remaining dishes. Those can wait till morning, she declared firmly. I'm an old woman who needs her rest. Besides, she added with a meaningful glance between them, I think you two have things to discuss. With that parting shot, she bustled out, leaving an awkward silence in her wake. Margaret turned back to the sink, focusing on the remaining dishes. She's right about one thing, it was a wonderful day. Yes, Jacob agreed, moving to stand beside her. Without asking, he picked up a towel and began drying the plates she'd washed. They worked in silence for several minutes, the familiar domestic task creating an unexpected intimacy. "What were you going to tell me?" Margaret asked finally. "During our dance, before Sarah interrupted." Jacob's hand stilled on the plate he was drying. "That I've been unfair to you." She looked up, surprised. "Unfair? How?" "When you first came here, I made it clear that I wasn't looking for—" He hesitated. "For anything beyond a governess for Sarah." "You did," she acknowledged. "And I accepted those terms. But things have changed," he said quietly. "Haven't they?" Margaret's heart hammered in her chest. "What are you asking me, Jacob?" It was the first time she had used his given name, and the sound of it seemed to affect him deeply. He set down the towel and turned to face her fully. "I'm asking if you could see a future here beyond your role as Sarah's governess. A future that might include—" He took a deep breath. "That might include becoming something more to both of us." The directness of the question left Margaret speechless. For months, she had carefully guarded her growing feelings, convinced that Jacob's heart remained too wounded by Rebecca's loss to consider opening it again. "Jacob, She began, then stopped, unsure how to proceed. His expression clouded. "I've spoken too soon. Forgive me." "No," she said quickly, reaching for his hand before he could withdraw further. "You haven't spoken too soon. It's just that I never expected, after what you said when I first arrived about not wanting to remarry." "I believed that when I said it," he admitted. "I thought Rebecca had taken that part of me with her when she died." His fingers tightened around hers. "But then you came, with your quiet strength and your kindness to Sarah. The way you brought life back to this house without trying to erase Rebecca's memory." "I would never try to replace her," Margaret said softly, "for either of you, I know." His voice was rough with emotion. "That's why. That's one of the reasons I've come to care for you, Margaret. You didn't try to claim her place. You created your own." The confession hung between them, breathtaking in its honesty. Margaret felt as though the ground had shifted beneath her feet, rearranging everything she had come to expect from her life at Rocking J Ranch. "There's something you should know," she said slowly. "About why I left Boston." Jacob nodded, waiting. "I was engaged," she revealed, the words painful even after all this time, "to a man named Richard Blackstone. He was charming, respected in society, and seemed everything a woman could want in a husband." She swallowed hard. "But it was all a facade. He was only interested in my father's law practice, which I had inherited. Once he realized I wouldn't sign it over to him before the wedding, he—" She paused, the memory still raw. "He showed his true nature. When I broke the engagement, he spread vicious rumors about me in society, made it impossible for me to stay." Jacob's expression hardened. "Did he hurt you?" "Not physically," Margaret assured him. "But he taught me to be wary of my own judgment, to question whether I could trust my heart again." "And now," Jacob asked, his voice gentle, "what does your heart tell you?" Margaret looked up at him, this man who had suffered his own profound loss, who had struggled to rebuild a life for his daughter, who had gradually allowed her to become part of that life. "It tells me that sometimes second chances come in unexpected ways," she said softly. "And that perhaps we both deserve one." The smile that spread across Jacob's face transformed him, erasing the lines of grief and worry that had marked him when she first arrived. Slowly, giving her every chance to withdraw, he leaned down and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was gentle, almost tentative, a question rather than a demand. Margaret answered by raising her hand to his cheek, drawing him closer. For that suspended moment, the kitchen disappeared, along with all the doubts and fears that had kept them circling each other for months. When they finally parted, Jacob rested his forehead against hers. "I never thought I'd feel this way again," he admitted. "After Rebecca died, I was certain that part of me was gone forever." "Life has a way of surprising us," Margaret replied, her voice unsteady. A creak on the stairs made them step apart. Sarah stood in the doorway, her hair rumpled from sleep, her eyes wide. "Sarah," Jacob began, clearly uncertain how to explain what she might have seen. But Sarah's expression wasn't confused or upset. Instead, a slow smile spread across her face. "I knew it," she said simply. "Knew what, sweetheart?" Margaret asked gently. "That you were going to stay forever." Sarah crossed the room and slipped her hand into Margaret's. "That you weren't like the others." Jacob knelt down to his daughter's level. "Sarah, Miss Margaret and I, we care for each other very much, but nothing has been decided yet about." "But you love her," Sarah interrupted with a child's directness. "I can tell. You look at her the way you used to look at Mama." Jacob's eyes met Margaret's over Sarah's head, vulnerability and hope mingled in his gaze. "Yes," he admitted, "I do love her." The simple declaration made Margaret's breath catch. It was the first time he had put the feeling into words. "And do you love Papa?" Sarah asked, turning to Margaret with equal forthrightness. Margaret felt as though her heart might overflow. "Yes, Sarah. I do love your father, and I love you too very much." Sarah's smile widened. "Then it's settled. You'll stay and be my mother now." "Sarah," Jacob began cautiously, "these things aren't quite so simple." But Margaret squeezed his hand. "Sometimes they are," she said softly. "Sometimes the heart knows what it wants with perfect clarity." Jacob's expression softened as he looked from his daughter to Margaret. "Yes," he agreed finally. "Sometimes it does." The ranch settled into a winter rhythm as December arrived, bringing snow that transformed the landscape into a pristine wonderland. The relationship between Margaret and Jacob deepened, their growing affection no longer hidden from Sarah or the ranch hands. News spread quickly through Beaver, and while there were inevitably some whispers about the propriety of a governess becoming involved with her employer, the general sentiment was approving. "About time Jacob found someone," Sheriff Thompson commented during a visit to the ranch. And Sarah couldn't ask for a better mother. Eliza Barnes was equally supportive when Margaret visited the general store. "We've all been hoping Jacob would open his heart again. Rebecca would have wanted it, you know. She wasn't one to hold with prolonged mourning." The Christmas season brought new opportunities for Margaret to create traditions that honored Rebecca's memory, while establishing her own place in the family. Sarah threw herself into preparations with boundless enthusiasm, insisting that they follow all the customs her mother had established while being equally receptive to Margaret's suggestions. "Mama always hung stockings here," Sarah explained, pointing to the mantelpiece. "And we put candles in the windows to guide the Christmas spirit. In Boston, we used to make ornaments from colored paper and ribbons," Margaret offered. "Would you like to try that?" Sarah's eyes lit up. "Can we do both?" "Of course," Margaret agreed, touched by the child's eagerness to blend their traditions. "We can do everything that makes Christmas special for you." One snowy evening, a week before Christmas, Jacob found Margaret alone in the parlor, wrapping small gifts she had purchased during her last trip to town. "You've been busy," he observed, noting the neat pile of packages. "I want everything to be perfect," she admitted. "It's our first Christmas together." Jacob sat beside her on the settee, his arm sliding comfortably around her shoulders. "It already is perfect because you're here." She leaned into him, still marveling at how natural it felt to accept his affection. "Jacob, there's something I've been meaning to ask you." He murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple. "What are your plans, our plans after the winter? Will I continue as Sarah's governess, or—" She let the question hang, uncertain how to articulate the future she hoped for. Jacob shifted to face her more directly. I had rather hoped you would consider a different position in this household." "Oh," she asked, her heart quickening. "What position did you have in mind?" Instead of answering immediately, Jacob reached into his pocket and withdrew a small box. Margaret's breath caught as he opened it, revealing a ring with a modest diamond flanked by two smaller sapphires. "My grandmother's," he explained. "It came west with my mother, and now I'm hoping it will find a permanent home with you." His eyes held hers steadily. "Margaret Allen, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Though she had sensed the conversation was heading in this direction, the actual proposal still left her momentarily speechless. Joy welled up within her, so powerful that it brought tears to her eyes. "Yes," she whispered, then more firmly, "Yes, Jacob, I would be honored to be your wife." His smile was radiant as he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as though it had been waiting all these years for her. "Sarah will be overjoyed," he said, drawing Margaret into his arms. "She's been dropping hints for weeks that I should make things official, as she puts it." Margaret laughed softly against his shoulder. "She's remarkably perceptive for her age." "She gets that from her mother," Jacob said, then added thoughtfully, "Rebecca would have liked you, you know. She valued honesty and kindness above all else." The mention of his late wife didn't bring the pang of jealousy or inadequacy that might once have accompanied it. Instead, Margaret felt a strange sense of connection to the woman who had shaped the two people she had come to love most in the world. "I wish I could have known her," she said sincerely. Jacob's arms tightened around her. "In a way you do, through Sarah, through this home she created." He hesitated. "I want you to know that loving you doesn't diminish what I felt for her. It's not a replacement, it's a continuation. A new chapter." "I understand," Margaret assured him, and she truly did. "Our pasts have shaped us, Jacob. Rebecca will always be Sarah's mother and a part of your life, just as my experiences in Boston, even the painful ones, led me here to you." He kissed her then, a kiss filled with promise and gratitude. When they finally separated, he said, "I thought we might marry in the spring when the wildflowers bloom in the high meadow. It was Rebecca's favorite place on the ranch." The suggestion touched Margaret deeply. "That sounds perfect." The following morning, they shared their news with Sarah over breakfast. The child's reaction was everything they could have hoped for: pure joy, followed by a flurry of questions about the wedding and what she could wear, and whether she might be allowed to hold the rings. "So you'll really, truly be my mother now?" she asked Margaret, her eyes shining. "In every way that matters," Margaret promised, drawing the girl into her arms. "Though I know I could never replace your real mother." "Mama would be happy," Sarah said with absolute certainty. "She told me once that if anything ever happened to her, she wanted Papa and me to be happy no matter what." She looked up at Margaret with complete trust. "And we are happy with you." The winter months passed in a whirl of preparations and deepening bonds. Margaret wrote to her few remaining friends in Boston, sharing her joy and inviting them to the spring wedding. Jacob expanded their bedroom, adding a sitting area where Margaret could read or sew in the evenings while he reviewed the ranch accounts. As promised, they were married in May 1877, in the high meadow that bloomed with wild lupine and Indian paintbrush. The entire town of Beaver turned out for the celebration, along with ranchers from miles around. Sarah, resplendent in a new blue dress, stood proudly beside them as Sheriff Thompson performed the ceremony. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," he declared, his voice carrying across the meadow. "Jacob, you may kiss your bride." As Jacob's lips met hers, sealing their vows, Margaret felt the final pieces of her life fall into place. She had come to Wyoming seeking safety and purpose. She had found not just those things, but a love she had stopped believing was possible. The celebration continued well into the night, with dancing and feasting reminiscent of their Thanksgiving revival. As twilight descended, Margaret found herself standing slightly apart, watching Jacob swing Sarah in a lively dance, both of them laughing with abandon. "You've healed them," Clara Thompson said, appearing at her side. "Both of them." "They've healed me too," Margaret replied honestly. "I came here broken in ways I didn't fully understand." "That's how love works best," Clara observed, "when it goes both ways." Later, as they prepared for their wedding night, Jacob took Margaret's hands in his. "I have something for you," he said, retrieving a small package from the dresser. Margaret unwrapped it to find a journal bound in soft leather. Opening it, she discovered the first page inscribed in Jacob's strong handwriting. "For Sarah, from her mother Margaret, to record the story of our family." Rebecca kept journals for Sarah, he explained, so that she would always have her mother's thoughts and memories. I thought you might want to continue the tradition, in your own way." Tears welled in Margaret's eyes at the thoughtfulness of the gift, the way it acknowledged both her place in their family and Rebecca's enduring legacy. "It's perfect," she whispered. "Thank you." Their life together unfolded with the rhythms of the ranch and the changing seasons. The following spring brought the birth of their son, William Jacob Jackson, a sturdy boy with Margaret's chestnut hair and Jacob's gray eyes. Sarah embraced her role as big sister with pride, reading to the baby from her lesson books and helping Margaret with his care. 2 years later, their family expanded again with the arrival of Emma Rebecca Jackson, named in honor of Jacob's first wife. As Margaret held her daughter for the first time, with Sarah and little William clustered around the bed and Jacob looking on with pride, she marveled at the fullness of her life. "Are you happy?" Jacob asked one evening, years later, as they sat on the porch watching their children play in the yard. Sarah, now 15 and blossoming into a beautiful young woman, was teaching 7-year-old William how to twirl 5-year-old Emma in a dance. Margaret leaned against his shoulder, her hand finding his with the ease of long familiarity. "Completely," she answered truthfully. "Are you?" "More than I ever thought possible after Rebecca died," he admitted. "You gave me back something I thought was gone forever, Margaret. You gave me hope." She turned her face up to his, still finding the same thrill in his kiss that she had experienced that first time in the kitchen. "And you gave me a home," she said softly. "Not just this ranch, but a place where I belong completely." As the sun set over the Wyoming landscape, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Margaret reflected on the journey that had brought her here. From the frightened, betrayed woman who had stepped off the train in Beaver 8 years ago to the confident wife, mother, and partner she had become. The path hadn't always been easy, but every step had led her exactly where she was meant to be. In the fading light, Sarah called out to them, "Papa, play your fiddle. William wants to hear the dancing song." Jacob laughed, rising from his seat. "Duty calls," he said, offering Margaret his hand. Together they joined their children in the yard, the family they had built through love, trust, and healing. As Jacob's fiddle sang into the evening air and their children danced beneath the emerging stars, Margaret knew with absolute certainty that this was what happiness truly meant, not the absence of past sorrows, but the courage to embrace new joys despite them. And as she caught Sarah's eye across the yard, seeing in the young woman's smile echoes of both the child she had been and the mother Margaret had never met, she felt a sense of completion. The circle that had begun with Rebecca's love for her family had expanded to include Margaret, not as a replacement, but as a continuation of that love. It was, she reflected as Jacob winked at her over his fiddle, the most beautiful kind of healing, the kind that honored the past while embracing the future with open arms and an open heart.